In 1896, I came across a patent approved by the United States Patent Office describing a method for collecting electrical energy directly from the atmosphere. The document contained no references to coal combustion, fuel generators, or centralized power distribution. It assumed electricity was already present, accessible, and abundant in the air itself. At the time, this idea was not presented as radical. It was filed quietly, without controversy. While examining photographs from the same era, I noticed something else. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, city skylines were dominated by tall, narrow towers topped with metal spires. Official records described them as churches, civic monuments, or purely ornamental structures. Yet many of these towers disappeared within a few decades. Following widespread floods in the mid-19th century, reconstruction efforts removed these vertical structures almost entirely, replacing them with wired grids and fuel-based systems. The official explanation frames this as technological progress. But the consistency of what was removed and the silence surrounding its removal raises a question that remains unresolved. When I began examining pre-modern towers, I started where most researchers are directed: architectural history texts, museum descriptions, and academic consensus. The official explanation is consistent and well established. These towers, I was told, served symbolic purposes. They were built to express religious devotion, civic pride, or aesthetic ambition. Their height represented spiritual aspiration. Their spires pointed toward the heavens as metaphors rather than mechanisms. Church records describe bell towers designed for sound projection. Civic documents refer to observation towers, clock towers, and commemorative monuments. In some cases, the towers are framed as competitive statements between cities, each attempting to outdo the others in scale and ornamentation. According to this narrative, the materials used, stone, copper, iron, were chosen for durability and visual impact, not functionality. I examined cathedral archives, architectural drawings, and restoration notes. In most cases, the internal documentation focuses on surface detail, carvings, facades, and symbolic geometry. Very little attention is paid to internal cavities, grounding systems, or metallic continuity from base to spire. When these features are mentioned, they are described as structural necessities or construction conveniences. The accepted explanation also places these towers firmly within cultural context. European towers are framed as Christian. Asian towers are described as Buddhist or ceremonial. Middle Eastern structures are labeled minarets. The differences in decoration are emphasized, while similarities in proportion and placement are often treated as coincidental. This interpretation is reinforced through education. Textbooks rarely question function beyond symbolism. Museums display scale models without internal cross-sections. Even modern restorations tend to preserve appearance while ignoring original internal design. I noticed that when towers were rebuilt after damage, their internal structures were often simplified or sealed entirely. The accepted explanation also assumes a linear technological progression. According to this model, societies gradually moved from symbolic architecture toward practical infrastructure. Ornamental towers gave way to smokestacks, power lines, and substations as scientific understanding advanced. Anything predating electrical electrification is categorized as incapable of functional energy systems. Yet, as I compared multiple sources, I noticed something missing. There was no unified explanation for why these towers shared similar heights, proportions, and urban placement across unrelated cultures. Nor was there a clear reason why so many were dismantled rather than repurposed when new technologies emerged. The official story is internally consistent, but consistency alone does not account for omission. It explains what the towers were supposed to mean, but not why they were built the way they were, or why they disappeared so quietly. This gap became more apparent as I moved beyond symbolism and began examining physical structure itself. As I shifted focus from symbolism to construction, the narrative began to show strain. I examined architectural surveys, renovation photographs, and demolition records. What stood out immediately were features that did not align neatly with decorative or religious purposes. Many towers contained continuous metallic elements running from the foundation to the spire. These were not isolated fixtures, but integrated systems. Copper bands embedded in stone, iron cores enclosed within masonry. In some cases, the spire itself was directly connected to subterranean components that extended below street level. The official explanation describes these as reinforcement, yet their configuration often exceeded what structural stability required. I also noticed hollow internal chambers that served no clear purpose. These cavities were frequently sealed during later renovations, making original analysis difficult. Where access was possible, the chambers showed signs of intentional design rather than accidental voids. Their symmetry and alignment suggested planning, not improvisation. Grounding systems were another anomaly. Some towers featured deep foundational elements made of conductive materials, extending into soil layers associated with moisture retention. In modern engineering, such features are associated with electrical grounding. In historical documentation, they are rarely explained beyond vague references to foundation stabilization. What raised further questions was standardization. Towers in different regions, built centuries apart, often followed similar ratios of height to base width. Their spires were positioned at comparable elevations relative to surrounding structures. This consistency appeared even in cities that had no documented contact with one another. If these were purely aesthetic or symbolic, the convergence in form is difficult to explain. Artistic styles usually vary widely across cultures. Here, decoration differed, but underlying geometry remained strikingly similar. I also examined material choices. Certain metals used in these towers were expensive and difficult to work with at the time. Their placement often favored conductivity over visibility. In several cases, decorative coverings concealed metallic frameworks rather than displaying them. Restoration reports revealed another pattern. When towers were repaired in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, metallic components were often removed or replaced with non-conductive substitutes. The stated reason was modernization or safety. Rarely was there discussion of original intent. None of this proves function, but the accumulation of anomalies challenges the simplicity of the accepted explanation. Decorative architecture does not require grounding systems. Religious symbolism does not demand internal metallic continuity. Reinforcement alone does not explain hollow chambers aligned vertically from earth to sky. At this stage of my research, I could not claim what these features were for. but I could say that the official narrative did not fully account for what was physically present. The structures themselves were asking questions that symbolism alone could not answer. After documenting individual anomalies, I widened the scope. Instead of studying towers in isolation, I compared them across continents. This is where pattern recognition became unavoidable. In Europe, towers were often positioned at city centers or elevated ground. In Asia, similar structures occupied central courtyards or hilltops. In the Americas, pre-industrial cities featured tall, spired buildings placed at key intersections or plazas. Despite cultural differences, the placement logic was consistent: elevated, centralized, and unobstructed. I mapped these locations against historical city layouts. In many cases, the towers predated surrounding buildings. Streets appeared to radiate outward from them. Later infrastructure was added around these vertical structures rather than the other way around. Height was another constant. While decoration varied, tower heights clustered within a narrow range relative to city scale. This was true even in regions with vastly different building traditions. Such convergence suggests shared knowledge or shared constraints that crossed cultural boundaries. By this point, the question was no longer whether anomalies existed. It was whether there was a system capable of explaining them collectively. That question led directly into historical discussions that modern narratives often treat as peripheral: atmospheric electricity. To understand whether these towers could have served a functional role, I examined scientific discourse from the 18th and 19th centuries. What I found was not fringe speculation, but mainstream inquiry. Atmospheric electricity was a serious field of study. Scientists documented electrical potential differences between ground and air. Experiments measured charge accumulation during fair weather, not just storms. Instruments were developed to collect and store small electrical currents from the environment. These were published in respected journals of the time. I examined patents describing methods for capturing electrical energy without fuel. These documents assume the atmosphere as an active medium. Some describe elevated collectors, conductive paths, and grounding systems. The language is technical, cautious, and exploratory. What struck me was how closely these descriptions aligned with the physical features I had documented in towers. Elevated metallic spires, continuous conductive paths, deep grounding elements, hollow chambers that could house equipment while remaining protected from weather. Importantly, these patents do not claim large-scale power generation. They explore localized collection, distribution, and experimental applications. The scale is modest, but the principles are clear. This context reframes the towers. If atmospheric electricity was actively studied, then structures optimized for elevation and conductivity would have practical value. Towers could serve as interfaces between environment and built space. I am not suggesting these systems powered entire cities. The evidence does not support such claims. But they may have served auxiliary roles: charging, signaling, or experimental distribution. The absence of surviving documentation makes certainty impossible. What is notable is how abruptly this line of inquiry faded. By the late 19th century, research focus shifted toward fuel-based generation. Atmospheric studies declined. Patents became historical curiosities rather than foundations. If towers were part of this experimental ecosystem, their removal would align with changing priorities. Systems incompatible with centralized grids would lose relevance. This does not require conspiracy. Economic efficiency, scalability, and control all favor centralized systems. But it does raise the question of whether alternative paths were abandoned rather than disproven. Chapter 4 represents the core of my investigation because it offers a system-level explanation capable of integrating anomalies, patterns, and timing. It does not provide certainty, it provides coherence. With a theoretical framework in place, I returned to historical events. The mid-19th century was marked by widespread flooding across Europe, Asia, and North America. Contemporary accounts describe streets buried in mud, foundations submerged, and entire districts rebuilt. I examined reconstruction plans. In many cities, rebuilding was rapid and transformative. Street levels were raised, new materials were introduced, older structures were dismantled rather than restored. Towers were frequently removed during this process. Official reasons include safety concerns and modernization, yet in many cases, towers were structurally intact. Their removal appears elective rather than necessary. Demolition records often lack detail. They note removal but not replacement. Unlike churches or government buildings, towers were rarely rebuilt in original form. Their functions, if any, were not transferred. This period also marks the rise of centralized infrastructure. Power stations, distribution lines, and regulatory bodies emerged. Urban space was reorganized to accommodate these systems. The coincidence of floods, reconstruction, and energy transition is significant. Disasters create opportunities for redesign. Systems that do not align with new models are often excluded. I found no evidence of deliberate suppression. What I found was administrative silence. Decisions made without explanation leave historical gaps. Over time, those gaps become normal. Once towers were gone, the need to explain them diminished. Future generations encountered only fragments, photographs, and symbolic interpretations. Function faded from memory. The quiet nature of this removal is perhaps the most telling feature. Revolutions announce themselves. Transitions often do not. Today, energy is centralized, regulated, and commodified. We depend on networks that are complex, vulnerable, and resource-intensive. This system is not inherently flawed, but it is singular. As I reflect on the evidence, I am struck by how little room modern narratives leave for alternative histories. The past is often framed as technologically naive, yet historical records suggest curiosity, experimentation, and diversity of thought. The towers raise questions rather than answers. Were they experimental, symbolic, functional? Possibly all three at different times. The evidence suggests overlap rather than exclusivity. What matters is not proving a lost technology, but recognizing lost inquiry. When certain paths are abandoned, their traces become anomalies rather than foundations. If atmospheric energy systems were explored and set aside, understanding why could inform present debates about sustainability and resilience, not as a solution, but as context. I do not claim these towers powered civilizations. I do not claim suppression. What I claim is uncertainty, and uncertainty deserves examination. The structures may be gone, but the questions remain. Why were they built the way they were? Why were they removed the way they were? And what other systems have we forgotten because they no longer fit the story we tell ourselves about progress? These are not conclusions, they are invitations to look again.